Coronavirus-related school closures have resulted in significant disruption to children and young people's learning in Wales, as it has elsewhere. So the impact of the disruption on educational attainment will be particularly acute for disadvantaged and vulnerable learners. And in the longer term, as well as widening inequalities, the Institute for Fiscal Studies warns that losing half a year of schooling without remedial catch-up interventions will result in school children missing out on an average of £40,000 in lifetime earnings. As a result, catch-up interventions will form a crucial part of reducing educational attainment losses. And it's key that the interventions that are chosen and their implementation are grounded in the best available evidence to ensure that they have as positive an impact as possible in a way that's driven by student need. So setting this evidence within the context of schools in Wales, as well as Welsh Government education priorities in terms of learners in greatest needs and curriculum areas will be essential to effective implementation. The most effective cohorts currently appear to be those pupils who are preparing for exams, so those in years 11, 12 and 13, vulnerable and disadvantaged children, so that's defined by a range of approaches, but include those from the poorest families, learners with special educational needs, learners from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, and learners in Welsh medium schools who live in non-Welsh speaking households. And the third group is year 7 pupils because of the disruption to the transition from primary to secondary schools. Ultimately, for catch-up interventions to be effective, it'll be important that we draw on evidence that relates to both which catch-up interventions are likely to be effective, so that's the what question, what should be delivered, and how these interventions can be put into practice in a way that ensures they're most effective, so catch-up strategies or how they should be delivered. So we'll take a look at the what questions first. So that is, what's the evidence on effective catch-up interventions? Just by way of background, catch-up interventions are often age and outcome specific. So that is, they focus on particular subjects or skills relative to average attainments at particular ages. So as an example, the Nuffield early language intervention is an oral language intervention for nursery and reception age children. That's been shown to have a positive effect on language skills, including at 6 months post-interventions. Other types of intervention may focus on non-academic skill development, such as social and emotional needs. And it's important that the content of the intervention is matched to the needs of the children. Overall, however, only a small number of robust evaluations have been conducted on catch-up interventions in the UK. So those interventions that have robust evidence-based are listed on the screen. So they include catch-up numeracy and catch-up literacy, both of which are available in Welsh, so Rhifedd Dyfaldonc and Llythrennedd Dyfaldonc. And there's also Talk for Literacy, Nuffield Early Language Intervention that I mentioned before, ABRA, First Class at Number and Switch On Reading. So evaluations of different catch-up interventions can provide an indication of what the common characteristics are that are associated with increased effectiveness. So these include interventions that meet a specific need. So for example, oral language skills are more likely to be effective. They're also more likely to be effective if the aims of the catch-up intervention aligns with the aims of whole class teaching. Effective intervention sessions tend to be short, so 20 to 50 minutes, delivered regularly and consistently and over a prolonged period, so 3 to 5 times a week for between 8 and 20 weeks. The evidence suggests that assessments should be completed to identify pupils that need interventions, to target focus areas in line with pupils' needs, to monitor progress both during and immediately after the intervention to ensure pupils can succeed afterwards. And also, assessments need to be accompanied by clear criteria for success and monitoring once the intervention ends, so to inform decisions on when to stop delivering catch-up interventions. So in an ideal world, structured catch-up interventions that have a strong evidence base should be prioritised for use in schools. So by structured, I mean interventions that have supporting resources and lesson plans with clear objectives that are delivered accordingly. However, where it isn't possible to implement structured evidence-based interventions, the common characteristics for effectiveness, as identified above, should be put in place as much as possible. But saying this, it's possible that unproven catch-up interventions may be required in some instances. So, for example, given the very small number of interventions that have been formally evaluated that are available in the Welsh language. So whereas the body of evidence on specific catch-up interventions is sparse, there's comparatively much more on catch-up strategies, so how they should be delivered and what makes that more effective. So the Education Endowment Foundation's review of one-to-one and small group tuition have identified a lot of evidence that support their impact as catch-up strategies, which I'll go into in a bit more detail. So firstly, on group size, the evidence suggests that catch-up interventions increase in effectiveness as group size decreases. So one-to-one delivery being the most effective and effectiveness reducing significantly once group sizes reach around 6 or 7 pupils. So for example, evaluations of a number of one-to-one UK tuition interventions demonstrated an average of 3 to 6 months additional progress. It's been suggested that the correlation between group size and impact might be explained by smaller groups allowing for more feedback and sustained engagement compared to larger groups, or a closer alignment with pupil needs. Saying this, while the trend's generally consistent, there is some variability. So for example, reading focused catch-up interventions that rely on small group tuition sometimes are shown to be more impactful than those that use one-to-one or paired teaching. So what we should take away from this is that while group size is important, it's not necessarily more important than teaching quality. And it's also important to evaluate the effectiveness of any catch-up intervention by taking into account the interaction between different group compositions and what subjects being taught. There's also been evidence on the educator type. So whilst catch-up interventions delivered by qualified teachers are likely to be most effective, followed by teaching assistants, and then volunteer-delivered interventions being the least effective. However, all 3 types of educators do demonstrate positive results, and it's also worth noting that training can result in a significant increase in the effectiveness of interventions delivered by teaching assistants or trained volunteers. So both the educator type and group size are important to consider in line with obvious budgetary constraints. So while one-to-one tuition costs an estimated £700 per pupil per term, this decreases to £233 for a 3-pupil group. And similarly, trained volunteers will have a lesser budgetary impact than qualified teachers. So in order to ensure that tuition is most effective, positive relationships between the catch-up educator, the classroom teacher, and the pupils are key, and that the learning in the interventions is consistent with work inside the classroom. Moving on to the how question. So knowing which interventions are most likely to be successful will only be successful if they're implemented and taught well. So we'll look at the evidence in relation to this next. So the slide here demonstrates key considerations for effective implementation. So these include resource considerations, which I've mentioned already. So that will need to take into account existing staff resource, potential capacity and training needs, and decisions on competing priorities should draw from the evidence base. So for example, while prioritising small group tuition might be less effective than one-to-one, it could be defended if those who fall behind are then more offered more intensive support. It's also important to bear in mind that catch-up interventions take up the time of pupils as well as those teaching them, and what pupils are being taken away from. So whether that's classroom-based learning or well-being related activities. So at a minimum, the catch-up intervention should have a larger positive impact than the activity they're being taken away from. And there's potential ways of overcoming those difficulties, such as doing them outside of the normal school day. However, ensuring that the views of schools and teachers are central to those decisions are key to ensure that they're well supported. And I've mentioned that alignment between classroom and catch-up intervention teaching is important. So ensuring that there's sufficient time for classroom teachers and educators to deliver catch-up interventions if they're different people, and to connect and liaise on what's being provided for pupils both inside and outside of the classroom. And lastly, in line with the Welsh Government's education priorities, catch-up interventions will focus on vulnerable and disadvantaged children in terms of the Recruit, Recover and Raise Standards programme. Learners in Welsh medium schools who live in non-Welsh speaking households and those in Year 7, and will focus on curriculum areas such as literacy, numeracy, independent learning skills and emotional needs. So A way of ensuring that interventions are targeted effectively is to use the 3 waves model, which is shown on the slide. So this assumes that the first wave of intervention should look at how the highest quality whole class provision can be provided, which then progresses to a second wave, which addresses needs as a group. And then the third wave for more additional, intensive and individualized support for those who have more high level needs. So using this model means looking at what's only absolutely necessary to deliver on a one-to-one basis. So bringing the evidence together, the briefing on catch-up interventions that we shared outlines a number of recommendations, which we'll be keen to get your thoughts on in the group discussions later. So it recommends that catch-up interventions put in place as part of the Recruit, Recover, Raise Standards plans should be supported by a robust evidence base for effectiveness, or in the case of unproven interventions, ensure they're delivered in line with common characteristics of effective interventions. They should be delivered in a way that maximises available resources, recognising that one-to-one and small group provision is likely to be most effective, and avoiding delivering at times which can take students away from equally important activities. They should connect with general classroom teaching and be accompanied by sufficient and high quality support for those delivering interventions. And lastly, assessments should be embedded throughout to ensure that the content and delivery is adequately targeted to pupils' needs.